Hey Kiri, this is Robert Ian with ConquerChange.com. The late Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, "You are entitled to your opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." The challenge in recent years is that individual opinions have been drowned out, and actual facts have been gaslighted. In the constant disarray of confusion, we refer to as mainstream media. Today, we'll discuss some of what that gaslighting actually looks like, how it transcends into everyday media discord, and how otherwise intelligent and well-informed people seem to somehow know what isn't so. On April 9th, constitutional law scholar Jonathan Turley posted on his website, jonathanturley.org, a commentary titled, "NPR Repeats False Claim That the Court Rejected Claims of Government Involvement in Censorship Efforts." Turley recounts a recent interview of his on NPR to discuss free speech. His blog article addresses a statement made regarding his NPR interview that is not accurate, but has been repeated like a mantra by many who are seeking to dismiss what he calls the censorship system under the Biden administration. The claim others are making and inferring is that the Supreme Court rejected the claim of coordination between the government and social media companies. Turley points out this is entirely untrue and urges readers not to take his word for it, but rather to read the Supreme Court decision themselves, in which the court expressly states otherwise. To set the record straight, Turley cites NPR host Lila Fadel, who quoted him as saying, "You had a level of coordination between the government and these other entities that the effect was that thousands were censored." The host then immediately rebutted Turley's comment by stating that last year, the Supreme Court rejected the claim that social media companies were pressured to take down posts about CV-19 and the election from 5 years ago. Turley further clarifies that this comment made by NPR is a reference to the court's decision in which the states of Missouri and Louisiana claimed that the federal government pressured social media companies to censor conservatives and critics. What the court actually ruled in a 6-3 ruling is that those states, Missouri and Louisiana, lacked standing to bring the case. A critical point in the court's opinion is that the justices went out of their way to expressly refute the notion that they were ruling on the merits of the coordination with the social media companies. To underscore this point, Turley cites footnote number 3 of the ruling, where the court explicitly states that because we do not reach the merits, we express no view as to whether the Fifth Circuit correctly articulated the standard for when the government transforms private conduct into state action. In other words, all the Supreme Court decided is that the two states bringing the case lacked standing to do so. A decision on the case itself about whether coordination actually occurred or whether such coordination violated the First Amendment was never rendered by the Supreme Court. Let me repeat that. A decision on the case itself was never rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court. Turley further articulated the clarification of his statement by saying it is demonstrably untrue that the Supreme Court rejected the claim that social media companies were pressured to take down posts about CV-19 and the election. He then recounts how other anti-free speech figures have repeated this bogus claim, namely when he testified in the U.S. Senate. A law professor, Marianne Franks, and a senator both repeated the claim. He quotes Professor Franks' comments to the committee, where she said, "For Republicans to call yet another congressional hearing to investigate the so-called censorship industrial complex of the Biden administration officials, nonprofit organizations, and big tech companies allegedly collaborating to censor conservative speech, a conspiracy theory so ludicrous." And here's where she repeats the bogus claim, when she says that even the current Supreme Court, stacked with a supermajority of far-right conservative judges, dismissed it out of hand last year in Murphy v. Missouri, while ignoring the current wholesale assault on the First Amendment by the Trump administration. Turley's blog links to the full transcript so you can read it if you like. The bottom line is that this often repeated false claim that continues to be made at Senate hearings and on major news shows by people who should know better, and probably do. This false claim is in conflict with the express words of the court. In other words, this claim that the U.S. Supreme Court rendered a decision on this case is a lie. I have followed Jonathan Turley's analysis of major issues for 3 decades, ever since the Bill Clinton administration, where I recall his position was that Clinton should be impeached, but not removed. Now, fast forward to today. Turley is no fan of President Trump. What he is a fan of, though, is the Constitution. He always has been. What became painfully obvious as I read this article is the realization that in the mainstream media, we seem to have fewer and fewer credible and articulate defenders of the U.S. Constitution and the principle of free speech. Jonathan Turley is one of those defenders. He says the effort to portray evidence of collaboration between the government and social media companies as a, quote, conspiracy theory or a myth is all too familiar. He says it attempts to portray free speech advocates as unhinged or fringe figures in order to avoid answering the troubling questions raised by things like the Twitter files, the Facebook files, and thousands of pages of documentation produced in both litigation and in Congress. He says some apologists for the censorship system have even attacked journalists as fans of Putin, which is why when media outlets like NPR compare the Trump administration to the McCarthyism of the 1950s that resulted in persecution of academics and leftists, they neglect to mention that today it is the left who has been using the very same tactics against free speech advocates. Turley points out that Hillary Clinton has called Tulsi Gabbard a Russian asset. Apparently, those who support restrictions on free speech do not want to address specific statements from social media executives that the government pressured them to censor critics and target individuals, which represents a clear and present danger that lurks within our social media backdrop and out of control mainstream media. where free speech, or more accurately, what remains of free speech, has been weaponized against ordinary people. The bottom line is that censorship is the antithesis of freedom and cannot be tolerated. And until next time, this is Robert Ian with ConquerChange.com. Thanks, Carrie.